The royal family has gathered in Scotland for their annual summer break at Balmoral. It marks a rare occasion that they're all together, but there's one high-profile absentee from this year's event.
At Balmoral, maids bow to empty rooms while scrubbing carpets on their knees, forbidden even from speaking. 18-hour shifts for scraps of pay were brutal, but bearable. What made them quit overnight wasn't the work, or the silence, or the aching bones. It was something darker they stumbled on in those gilded halls. Something no paycheck could excuse.
So my colleague took the phone and he said, "Listen to me, you fat lardy ass. Let my guest in immediately or I'm going to come down there." Everyone heard it, apologised, and we just let her in. So after that, obviously, those sort of issues we had with him, we would just let women in.
And no tradition could disguise. Stick with us to the end to discover what they found. Let's start by stepping inside Balmoral, where the castle's rules reveal just how harsh life was for those who served there. A castle built on secret. There is something about Balmoral Castle that has always invited whispers. Tucked deep in the Scottish Highlands, hidden behind forests and guarded by miles of private land, it has long been the setting for the monarchy's most private dramas. For the maids who worked there, the place was less a fairy tale retreat, and more a web of quiet rules and unspoken stories. To understand why, you have to go back to how it all began. In 1852, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's German-born husband, quietly set the stage. One rainy summer day, he spotted a newspaper ad for a rundown Highland estate and decided it was exactly what the royal family needed. Without telling Victoria, he spent £32,000, more than $4 million today, to buy the property. He had already tested it by leasing it in 1848, but on the 11th of October that year, he secured it outright. Victoria was smitten with the wild Highland air, so different from the heavy atmosphere of London's palaces. But the Balmoral they inherited was no grand castle. It was an aging, cramped house that had stood since 1390. Albert wasted no time. Within months, he ordered it torn down and set about designing a new residence. By 1856, a new Balmoral was erected with white granite walls, towers, and turrets straight out of a Scottish baronial fantasy. Albert even designed the clock tower himself, inspired by castles from his childhood in Germany, and had it tuned to chime in soft E-flat so as not to disturb the ponies outside. He insisted the hallways be narrow to force family members to cross paths more often, believing it would keep them close. Over time, the estate expanded to more than 53,000 acres, dotted with 150 smaller buildings, powered by its own hydro plant, and even served by a discreet 3-mile railway to move royal luggage without drawing attention. Not everyone was impressed. Early critics called the castle a giant cold barn, but Victoria adored it, describing in her journals the crisp, pine-scented air as freeing her from the burdens of court life. Yet Balmoral was more than a royal holiday home. Its isolation made it the perfect refuge for secrets. Rumors about Victoria's unusually close bond with her Highland servant, John Brown, took root here, far from London's prying eyes. Some claimed the relationship went beyond loyalty and friendship, and letters uncovered recently have added new weight to those suspicions. For the staff who worked these narrow corridors, the castle's carefully planned intimacy came at a price. The new castle's narrow corridors didn't just bring the royals closer together. They trapped the staff inside a web of watchful silence. The walls themselves seemed to listen and remember. And soon, those walls would become the maids' greatest fear. The walls that watched them. They say the walls of Balmoral remember everything. Long after the footsteps fade and the voices go quiet, the narrow corridors seem to hold on to the whispers about the kings who plotted in the night. the servants who vanished after one wrong word, and the tragedies that reshaped the crown. Even today, staff speak of a strange feeling in those passages, as if the castle itself is watching and waiting. A maid carrying a tray of silver could turn a corner and suddenly come face to face with the queen, forced into a hasty bow while trying not to spill a thing. Every step felt exposed, every whisper carried too far. Inside the castle's 167 rooms, the contrast was stark. The entrance was carved with the faces of Victoria and Albert's 9 children, a homage to family unity. Windows opened to catch the Highland breeze Victoria praised in her journals as healing and peaceful, especially after Albert's death. But for those below stairs, the romance quickly faded. Records kept in the royal archives describe servants in the 1860s polishing oak panels late into the night by candlelight, the air heavy with wax and fatigue. The comforts of the royal family often meant hard labor for the staff. More than 50 fireplaces consumed 60 tons of birchwood each winter. Logs were hauled up narrow spiral stairs before dawn, so the royal family could enjoy the warmth. The castle's remoteness has always worked to its advantage, shielding the family's privacy. Even in recent times, it has attracted unwanted attention. In 2019, a cleaner secretly photographed the royal children's woodland treehouse and leaked the images online, prompting security crackdowns. By 2024, no drone zone signs lined the estate's fences, and motion sensors and patrols guarded the grounds. Balmoral's isolation has also been the backdrop for moments that shaped royal history. In 1936, Edward VIII paced the narrow corridors as he prepared the speech announcing his abdication. After Princess Diana's death in 1997, aides delayed telling young William and Harry, allowing them to spend a final day playing by the river before their world changed. The control has not only been physical, but also financial. Balmoral is private property of the royal family, not part of the public crown estate. For decades, proceeds from deer hunting and cottage rentals have gone directly to the family. Complaints raised in Parliament in 1905 over deer culls, funding estate improvements, were dismissed by Edward VII, who called Balmoral the family's inescapable refuge. That sense of watchfulness has persisted. Rumor has it that there is a network of discreet GPS tracking of staff on estate trails to streamline movements and prevent idle wandering. Archival records reveal that even in the 19th century, early keepers tracked workers' movements. At Balmoral, one wrong step could cost a servant their position, and their silence was expected. The walls may have kept the family's secrets, but for the maids, they became a constant reminder that every move, every whisper was being measured. And when summer came, the walls felt even closer. Because that's when the castle turned from a retreat into a siege. The summer siege. For the maids at Balmoral, summer isn't a holiday, it's a nightmare. As the season approaches, the workload surges beyond reason, and every mistake under the watchful eyes of the royals can cost them their place. They know what is coming. Weeks of back-breaking work under strict silence, with eyes everywhere and no room for mistakes. At the heart of it is the hunting season, which begins in late August. The castle swells from a quiet retreat into a bustling camp of nearly 150 people brought in to keep the royal machine running. For the staff, especially the maids, it feels less like seasonal work and more like an unspoken test of endurance and loyalty. The day begins long before dawn. Staff are jolted awake by the sound of bagpipes under the king's window, not as a romantic tradition, but as an alarm that signals the start of another 18-hour shift. Maids stumble out of attic rooms to polish more than 200 pieces of silver, before the first breakfast bell rings at 8 in the morning. They peel 18 kilograms of potatoes for lunch, rush to serve tea in the late afternoon, where even a poorly folded napkin can bring a sharp glance, and end the night scrubbing boots still damp with the day's hunt. Hunting season transforms the castle grounds. Gillies, the seasoned Highland gamekeepers, lead the royal party across the moors in search of red deer. Others manage the ponies and prepare picnics by the River Dee, where the royal family makes a show of rustic charm, sometimes even washing their own plates in the river. For the staff, there is no such ease. They keep silent, move quickly, and stay unseen unless addressed directly. The work is relentless. Fires must be kept burning in more than 50 hearths through the chilly nights. Each winter consumes around 60 tons of birchwood, much of it hauled up narrow stairs before dawn. The deer culls remain controversial, with Balmoral contributing significantly to the 1,000 to 2,000 animals culled annually across the region, despite modern environmental pressure to scale back. The strain extends beyond the labor. Local families have long supplied about 40% of the household staff, bound by generations of tradition and, as some say, by an unspoken loyalty clause. Generations of local families kept returning to serve, but loyalty didn't spare them from the punishing summer grind. For a single night each year, however, it seemed as if the burden lifted until the illusion shattered on the ballroom floor. Hit the like button if you think you could endure even a single day of that grind, because the real story behind why so many of them finally walked away is only just beginning. The Gillies Ball, one night when the walls almost fell. For Balmoral's staff, the Gillies Ball isn't the night of joy that outsiders imagine, it's the longest shift of the year. While the royals dance, the maids and footmen scramble to keep the night flawless, knowing that one wrong move under the chandeliers can end a career. To outsiders, it is just an old-fashioned dance. To the staff, it is the one night a year when the invisible walls between them and the royals seem to waver. But that illusion never lasts. The tradition began in 1858, when Queen Victoria, newly settled at Balmoral after Prince Albert's quiet purchase of the estate, threw a celebration to thank the Gillies, the rugged men who guided the hunts and managed the wild hills. Victoria herself led the first Scottish reels, pulling in everyone from dukes to dishwashers, if only for a few dances. For a few hours, the ballroom's Highland murals by Landseer, lit under the glow of chandeliers, made it seem as though the whole castle belonged to Scotland itself. But the divide was never far away. Even the invitations made it clear. Gold-trimmed cards for trusted inner-circle staff, plain white for the rest. That subtle code set the tone from the beginning. There was always a line, even at the ball. Through the years, the evening developed a reputation. Prince Philip was rumored to spike the punch with gin, loosening the air and leading to barefoot dances under the chandeliers. Then came the breaking point. In 1991, a young footman, unable to resist the lure of a tabloid payday, revealed the ball's unguarded side: barefoot dances, loosened ties, and royal laughter well past midnight. He was dismissed immediately, his career in service over. That same year, the documentary Elizabeth R. captured rare footage of the Queen dancing with Prince Charles. But after the leak, cameras were banned, and the event disappeared behind Balmoral's locked doors once again. Even under King Charles, the tradition continues, with a stricter layer of secrecy. His first full ball as monarch in 2024 came with tighter non-disclosure agreements. Recently, eco-friendly touches, local brews, and reduced waste have been introduced. But the atmosphere stayed the same, a fleeting illusion of closeness that never survived the dawn. One Maids blog, long since deleted, described the moment she accidentally called then Prince Charles Sir in the middle of a spin. The music kept playing, but for her, it felt like the room stopped. That moment summed up the truth of the Gillies Ball. It is the castle's great illusion. A single night when the gap between servant and sovereign appears to close, only to snap back harder the next morning. Because the glittering chandeliers hid a darker cost, one that drained their strength long before dawn. The hidden cost of royal perfection. The shine of Balmoral's halls has always come at a price, paid in endless labor before dawn. Every polished plate, every spotless carpet hides the hours of grinding work that staff endure in silence, knowing one slip could make them jobless. Step inside Balmoral before sunrise, and the first thing you hear is not voices, but the scrape of rags on silver. By 6 a.m., staff are already at work in the oldest, coldest part of the castle, polishing 200 pieces until they shine, because the slightest clink can set off the corgis, and one bark can cost you your day's break. It's a rule everyone knows, but no one dares question. Breakfast must be ready by 8. Trays are carried silently through narrow halls. The staff learn to move like ghosts, because one dropped spoon means starting over. Lunch brings its own grind. Mountains of potatoes, 18 kilos or more, peeled at speed before they rush to change uniforms for afternoon tea. Napkins must be folded into precise fans, and tea poured to the second, all while the clock reminds them there is no room for error. When the hunting parties return, the work gets harder. Mud-caked boots and blood-stained gear stack up by the back door, waiting to be scrubbed clean. The smell of polish mixes with the metallic tang of the day's kills. By nightfall, staff drag themselves up to the attic dormitories, cramped, drafty rooms that barely keep out the Highland cold. Promises of improvements came often and late. Staff meetings in the late 1980s talked about heaters for the attic, but they arrived only in 1992 after health inspectors pushed for them. By then, many workers had already left for hotels in Inverness, where pay was better, and the kitchens at least kept them warm. The hardships weren't just history. Leaked emails showed that 60-hour weeks were still being treated as standard across the royal estates. The rule was unwritten, but absolute. Balmoral's perfection came first, and comfort for the people who maintained it came last. Behind the glamour seen in photographs, the reality for staff was a relentless routine that turned loyalty into exhaustion and kept the castle's shine resting on the strain of those who remained silent. The endless grind might have broken their bodies, but it was the unwritten rules that finally crushed their spirit. Rules so rigid and demeaning that even silence could be a punishable offense. Rules that broke the Maids. Some of Balmoral's most punishing rules weren't about the long hours or the harsh weather. They were about silence, submission, and rituals that drained strength as much as they did dignity. One of the strictest came from Queen Elizabeth's dislike of vacuum cleaners. Since the 1950s, she insisted on peace and quiet in her homes. By 1956, a decree banned electric vacuums at Balmoral, forcing staff to clean the castle's carpets by hand. Maids spent 45 minutes on each hallway, bent over horsehair brushes, wrists swelling, aprons covered in dust that had to be rinsed twice a day. This resulted in logging 9 extra hours of work a day in 1990 alone, without a single extra pound in wages. But the physical toll was only part of it. There was also the rule of constant deference. Staff had to curtsy or bow every time they crossed the path of a royal, even if the royal had already left the room. The practice became known among workers as curtsying to ghosts. At the 1987 Gillies Ball, staff reportedly counted 61 curtsies in a single evening. By the end of the night, some were handing out bandages alongside trays of drinks. Despite the obvious strain, the tradition never changed. The silence rule was even harsher. Every word overheard in the halls had to be treated as if it didn't exist. One story from July 1986 tells of a maid who was dusting a side table when she accidentally heard Prince Charles and Princess Diana whisper to each other. A senior staffer warned her on the spot to act deaf. The next morning, she found a written warning under her door. Break the code of silence and lose your end-of-season bonus, $250, and your job. Over time, staff created their own silent code, using hand signals during service to pass messages. A flick of the wrist might mean pass the cream. 2 taps on the table might warn someone to step back as a royal approached. The system worked, but it deepened the sense that the staff were living in fear, not just working. For many, the rules felt less like tradition and more like chains, demanding obedience while offering little in return. For the Maids of Balmoral, survival meant obeying the rules, but those rules often broke them long before they ever quit. The maids could endure the bruised wrists and sleepless nights, but not the sense that their suffering meant nothing. And nothing proved it more than the pay slips that revealed how little their devotion was worth. Share this with friends who think old traditions are harmless, because the next part of this story shows just how far those traditions went in breaking the people who kept the castle running. The palace pay divide. Behind the polished gates of the royal estates lies a truth that rarely reaches the public, one that has quietly bred resentment for decades. The problem isn't the long hours or even the grueling work. It's the numbers on the pay slip that never seem to match the weight of the labor. In the late 1980s, a housemaid at Balmoral earned about $18,000 a year before taxes, while working 60 hours a week. Many lived on the estate year-round in drafty attic quarters that felt closer to servant halls from the Victorian age than the modern era. Part of their duties included emptying chamber pots still in use beneath 4-poster beds, an indignity few expected in the closing years of the 20th century. A promotion to first housemaid might mean $21,500 a year, but that step up often took years and came only if one endured the cold, the endless hours, and the silence. It is little wonder that many maids quit after a single season, leaving the palace constantly training fresh recruits who had not yet realized what they were stepping into. Recent disclosures show how stubborn the gap has remained. A leaked 2024 payroll slip revealed that a palace maid still earned about $19,500 a year. In contrast, a senior royal aide collected $146,000. The disparity underscored what many staff had long suspected, that their toil propped up an institution that rewarded them the least. The frustration only deepened when the sovereign grant, the taxpayer-funded budget that supports the monarchy, rose from $86.3 million. That 53% jump was driven by profits from Crown estate properties, yet most staff saw their pay rise by only about 6%, if at all. Entry-level housekeeping jobs were initially posted at $22,000, just above the legal minimum wage, and were increased to £24,188 only after public backlash. All this unfolded while the king's private fortune, drawn from timber sales, tourism, and estate income, climbed past $1.8 billion. For many staff, that wealth felt more distant than ever. The growing tension between the palace's riches and its workers' wages turned loyalty into disillusionment. Disillusionment spread quietly at first, but it only needed one voice to pierce the silence, one betrayal that would shatter Balmoral's centuries-old code and drag its secrets into the spotlight. the 1988 betrayal that rocked the palace. For decades, Balmoral's staff had lived by an unspoken code. Whatever they saw or heard behind the castle walls stayed there. That illusion of silence was shattered in March 1988, when a young maid, barely 8 weeks into her summer posting the year before, sold her story to the French magazine Paris Match. For $10,000, roughly the equivalent of nearly 8 years of her palace wages, she revealed details the royal household had assumed would never leave the estate. Within days, British tabloids seized on the story. Headlines blared across front pages, and millions devoured accounts of the royals as if they were neighbors rather than distant figures behind stone walls. The Maids' anecdotes mixed charm with embarrassment. The corgis that snored outside Princess Anne's door, a dinner guest so unfamiliar with formal dining that he drank from the rose-scented finger bowl, and the astonishing moment when the entire table joined in to spare him humiliation. There were also glimpses of softer scenes, Prince Charles fetching Diana's coat before a riverside picnic, Diana herself quietly slipping stable hands tips for their care of nervous ponies. But the portrait was not all gentle. The Maid recalled the strained 1987 Balmoral visit by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. While the palace insisted Thatcher stayed inside the castle, staff whispered that she had been housed in a remote cottage on the edge of the estate and had skipped a morning grouse hunt. The talk hinted at an icy standoff between the monarch and the Prime Minister that official statements denied but never fully dispelled. The palace reacted within hours. A statement condemned the publication as a gross breach of trust, and a sweeping internal review began. All 348 staff who had worked that season were scrutinized. Background checks for new hires grew more intense, and employees were required to sign stricter secrecy agreements tied to the Official Secrets Act. Anyone who spoke to the press risked lawsuits and the end of their career. The Maids' revelations also included smaller, humanizing details that surprised outsiders. The Queen carefully saving used wrapping paper in a dog treat tin at Christmas, or scraping a slice of lemon from her plate for use in the next day's trout dish. Such thrift contrasted sharply with the grandeur on display and did little to ease long-standing complaints about low pay and harsh conditions. The Maids' revelations exposed the cracks in the castle's facade, but the institution held on, at least for a time. Decades later, the same anger would erupt again, only this time it wouldn't stop at headlines. It would bring Balmoral itself to a standstill. When Balmoral finally broke. Recently, Balmoral's long-kept order snapped. The gates stayed shut, not just because of the storm outside, but because years of relentless work and silent resentment finally drove the staff to walk out, leaving the castle exposed. It started quietly, an online review, a few resignations, whispers in staff corridors. But by the summer of 2025, Balmoral faced a collapse no storm could mask. On July 18, 2025, the gates stayed locked at 7:30 a.m., officially because of Storm Florus battering the Highlands with 90-mile-an-hour winds. But insiders knew better. 2/3 of the room attendants had quit the night before, many sleeping on rotting hut floors with leaking roofs. Tourists stood stranded in the rain, unaware that the real disaster was not the weather, but years of pent-up resentment finally breaking loose. The chain reaction had begun more than a year earlier. On March 9, 2024, a housekeeper's blistering review on a job site called Balmoral Toxic, describing bosses who berated staff in front of guests and penalized them for the smallest slip, like missing a speck of dust on a picture frame. Maids were expected to clean a dozen suites before lunch, including Camilla's room, in under an hour, or forfeit their break. Pay hovered at less than $11 an hour, below the UK living wage. That single post triggered 5 resignations in a week, and comments from ex-workers revealed a pattern. Nearly 70% had quit citing bullying or chronic disrespect. Speaking out came at a price. Non-disclosure agreements, tightened in 2022, threatened lifelong gag orders with lawsuits that could cost 6-figure sums. Still, complaints mounted. More recent sparks, like the viral 2023 post by a maid known online as Heather Glenn, who was denied leave for her mother's surgery, kept the sense of injustice alive. Conditions outside Balmoral were little better. At Highgrove, the King's estate in Gloucestershire, almost the entire gardening staff quit between 2022 and 2023-25, citing 60-hour work weeks for wages of around $22,000 a year. Injuries from hauling heavy compost or planting thousands of flowers by hand went largely uncompensated. By mid-2025, staff turnover at Balmoral hit 38%, double the industry norm. So when the gates closed that July morning, it wasn't just a storm that shut out the crowds. It was the breaking point. Years of unpaid overtime, harsh rules, and widening pay gaps, finally forcing workers to walk away. The image of royal tradition held for centuries had cracked, and the silence inside Balmoral's halls was no longer loyalty. It was a warning. If even Balmoral, the most private royal refuge, can be brought to its knees by those who once kept it running, what does that say about the future of the monarchy itself? Do you think the staff were right to finally walk away? Or should they have stayed to preserve the castle's legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you want to uncover more untold stories that reveal the truth behind the royal walls, don't forget to subscribe. The next revelation might be even more shocking. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.